Hey BookTube, DG Wiggins and Daisy back here again with another book review. Today I'm talking about the whole Bobiverse series. That's 3 books by Dennis E. Taylor. So that is book 1, We Are Legion, book 2, For We Are Many, and book 3, All These Worlds. In the past, I have been a huge sci-fi fan, but it has been a while, mainly because I have been reading a ton of fantasy, ramping up in preparation for what I've been writing for NaNoWriMo, but I came across this find just recently, and I couldn't hold myself back. So, I ended up reading all 3 books in like a weekend. It was that good. At least for me, it really hit what I enjoyed. So I was really excited to do this book review because I get to just sort of fanboy over it a little bit. I am fairly practical still. There's a few nitpicks that I have, but I did go through this entire series in just a matter of a couple of days. All through audiobooks, of course, just to save my eyes a little bit. I do a lot of reading to begin with for my day job, so I do tend to lean towards Audible. If your interest is piqued by this review, I'll leave a link in the description below. As with my previous book review, I'm working with this new sort of format just to kind of keep myself from rambling too much. I'm going to talk about the hook, or what kind of hooks my attention at the beginning of the book, the characters, the setting, the writing style, the pacing, the climax, the resolution, and then just wrapping up with my general likes and dislikes. The first half should be fairly spoiler-free. The second half, no guarantees. I'll let you know when we get there. So, starting off, let's talk about the hook. The hook in book 1 is completely different from the rest of the book. Now, part of that is that it is essential for setting up the premise of the book, explaining why the characters are the way they are, why the world is the way it is. If you didn't have that, you would need a heck of a prelude to all of this, or a preamble, or whatever you call them. So I will say that the hook does not necessarily do a great job of setting up sort of a promise for this is what you're getting for the rest of the book. But it is very quick, very concise, and very good at explaining and laying the foundation for a lot of stuff to come. Basically, we have the original Bob, and we'll talk about why I say the original later on, but the original Bob as a wealthy software entrepreneur who has just sold his business, and he's going to a tech convention talking about space stuff and just nerding out. There is a bit of sort of character description where he is struggling over a recent breakup with a girlfriend or something like that, which does sort of throw me in retrospect that they never come back to talk about that breakup like ever again. So I don't know why we needed that. Maybe it's just flavor, I don't know. But if you're reading through that and you're like, oh, breakup scenes are not my thing, the breakup scene isn't even there. It's just a reference. But that isn't necessarily part of the rest of the series at all. Anyway, he gets through his tech conventions and he learns a few things. He signs up to have his head cryogenically frozen so that at a later time he can come back to life after death. And then he dies. That's not really spoiling anything. You would get as much from just understanding the premise of the book. That's all kind of chapter 1 stuff. Flip through later on to anything else in the book, and you find him as an AI. Basically, he comes back in the future, much later in the future. Technology has gotten a lot better, but the world has changed quite a bit, and he is now this AI that's integrated with a computer system, and he's able to kind of self-replicate, make more of himself, and it gets a lot more interesting. Let's talk about the characters. There is, original Bob, and then there is Bob 1. Bob 1 is the first AI that was made based off of original Bob. Then you've also got all of Bob's clones, which throughout the series, these clones keep replicating, making more clones, so it's really hard to keep track of who's who. But they are all renditions of original Bob 1. The interesting thing about this is that each time they replicate, they have some personality quirks. So some of them are a little bit more skittish, or some of them are a little bit more techie, a little bit more smart, a little bit nerdy, a little bit more goofy. There's always some variation in the cloning so to speak, process of these Bobs. So they're all very much the same, and yet they each have their sort of quirks, and that's how you kind of identify them. That, and you also identify a Bob by kind of what project he has picked up in the universe. So Bob 1 and another Bob who has taken the name Garfield, they go off and play God to a primitive but intelligent species. They're kind of still in the Stone Age, but they have communications, and they have axes and flint and communities, and they're growing, and they're kind of playing God to these people, mainly to help them to not go extinct before they have a chance to develop as a civilization. There's Bill. Bill's probably my favorite. He, from the day that he gets cloned, he basically says, I'm going to just stay here, and I'm going to set up shop and basically research, and I'm going to learn to do faster than light communications, and I'm going to be sort of the hub for all the other Bobs. So he sets up sort of this skunk works and builds android bodies for these Bobs, these AIs to inhabit and go and like interact with actual people or with aliens or with whatever. He holds Bob meetings in basically a VR pub that he's set up, and he hosts Bob VR based baseball games. All of this in the interest of keeping their humanity, which is an ongoing theme. He also picks a planet and says, I'm going to terraform that. I'm going to make it habitable. It's going to take me a while, but I'm going to drop glaciers on it. I'm going to, basically work with what I've got to make a habitable planet as a colonization target someday. There's another Bob named Mario. He, from the day that he is cloned, is super introverted. He's just like, I don't want to talk to any of you guys. I'm going to go that way. He basically picks a direction and just says, I'm going deep space. I'm going to see what's out there. There's another Bob who takes on the name Reiker. And he is, originally he's sort of a Star Trek buff, but he decides he's going to go back to Earth, because at some point they leave Earth, but he's going to go back to Earth. He's like, I'm going to find out what's happening. I'm going to see if the human race is still around. And he ends up dedicating his life to saving the human race from themselves. There is another Bob named Homer. And I really like Homer too, actually. But he basically was Bob with a Simpsons addiction. And so he is just sort of goofy. He's just funny. But he also has his own project. He becomes basically this farm tycoon. He learns to make space-based farming space stations so that he can provide food to the people on Earth, and then later on to all the colonies around the universe. He's really a cool character. Lastly, you've got a Bob named Khan, who is later followed up by several other Bobs. I think there's one Thor and a couple others. They take on these sort of warmongering sort of names, mainly because their purpose in life, why they were cloned, was to go wage war against this other AI named Medeiros, who is basically a threat to the universe. And so they are more militant in nature, but still all rooted in the same software entrepreneur personality. It's still sort of this nerd culture about all of these characters. Next, I want to talk about the setting. The setting is in, of course, interstellar space. One thing that you can really appreciate from the writer is his obvious research into so much space-related stuff. He's throwing out these sort of code names for different universes and then making pop culture references or nerd culture references to how those systems or planets were referenced in Star Trek or Star Wars or this or that, and that becomes an integral part of the storytelling, who's where and doing what. Next, I want to talk about the writing style. The writing style is fairly, I would say, low on humor. The humor is still there, but it's no Douglas Adams. It's not necessarily a comedy book, but you still have characters like Homer cracking jokes here and there. There's a few moments where you'll grin a little bit, but it is kind of low on humor and high on imagination, I would say, for lack of a better way of describing that. There are so many things going on in this universe, and they all interconnect and weave, and then you've got, this one character who has branched off into just hundreds of variations of himself. And so you kind of get this sort of split personality story going on, and there's a lot of concern of are we still human? There isn't anything physically human about us anymore. We're all computers, but we're all based off of a human AI or a human personality. And so what is our place in life? And so there's a lot of just deep thought that goes into a lot of these situations, which I think is sort of the mark of really good sci-fi. Sci-fi in itself is supposed to be really good at getting you to think of what if I were in a computer? What if I were a deep space probe? What if I were an android? What if, I wasn't even human anymore, and yet I still felt and acted and wanted to be human? What if I were essentially a god to a civilization in the Stone Age? You also see a lot of imagination that went into the varieties of planets. You've got the water planet, and you've got the gas giants, and you've got the moons, and you've got the different problems that colonists face. There's problems of giant bugs, there's dinosaurs on one planet, there's all kinds of things that he's just sort of pulled from different directions, and it's like, you've really kind of diversified this book for me. Next, I want to talk about the pacing. The pacing I felt was very good, and it did have a good variety of pacing. You're either up here and you're really wanting to know what's going on, high intensity, there's space battles or arguments going on, fights to the death, or you're kind of down low and everyone's looking around saying, what's happened here? Let's recuperate, let's talk it out in the pub and explain a little bit to the reader the significance of what just happened. And then we're back up to the high intensity stuff. Something else is happening. All right, so we're about halfway. Next, I'm going to talk about the climax. And I've tried not to spoil anything too much, but at this point, it's the climax. I'm going to talk about the climax, so prepare for spoilers. For the climax of these books, all three, it's hard to necessarily nail down which Bob is experiencing the climax. You've got a lot of different battles going on, a lot of different things, and I'd say one thing that this book sort of suffers from, and this is not unique to this book, particularly in sci-fi, is that you've got stuff going on in different parts of the universe, different planets, different characters are doing completely different things, and so you've got a lot of head hopping, a lot of POV changing throughout the book. And one thing that happens is that you find yourself being really invested in one plot line and less invested in another. And so maybe you're really into the plot line about the Bob who's playing God to the Stone Age civilization. You get done with that chapter, and then you go back to another plot line that's interesting but not as interesting. You're like, but I wanted to know more about Bob. Why are we talking more about Mario or Homer or some other Bob that's doing something maybe less interesting? And so you do kind of struggle with that. And yet at each point, or at some point, each of those plot lines have their own sort of climax. Something happens, and it's not always exactly at the end of one of the three books. I would say if there was a climax for the whole series, it is probably a final battle that sort of everything sort of culminates up to at the end of the third book, which would make sense. It's the end of the third book. But basically, Earth is being attacked by this civilization that does not treat anybody else like they need to survive any longer. Basically the world and basically the universe and all of its inhabitants are food to them. They're sort of this Borg, but there's no assimilation aspect to this alien civilization. They're just sort of called the others. But they're coming, and they are pissed off, and they're going to annihilate Earth and all of its inhabitants. And there is this huge push against, overwhelming odds among all of the Bob clones and the inhabitants of Earth to basically fend off Earth from this invasion. And it is a hard to follow climax. There's so many moving parts, and again, this is something that I think sci-fi tends to kind of struggle with. That said, I made it through the book. I came out okay, and I enjoyed it. It wasn't something that I had to sit there and read 2 or 3 times just to figure out, okay, what's going on here. But it is a climax that you need to pay attention to, that you need to kind of slow down. And you know, I listen to it on Audible. So most of the time when I'm listening to audiobooks, I'm doing something else. But at least during this climax, it was like, okay, I'm going to just sit down in this chair and listen through this part, because I don't want to miss anything, or I'll be not understanding anything later on, if that makes sense. There are other scenes like that in the other books. There's a battle between Khan and Bobiverse that you kind of have to pay attention to, you know, who's firing what missiles and what's going on. There's certain battles between others. You know, there's a courtroom battle that goes on between one of the Bobs and an actual human woman. It's not between him and her, but between him and her daughter. And the daughter believes that her mother should not be dating this AI. So, you know, there's a lot of variety to these books, and there are certain climaxes, I would say, that you need to do them justice. You need to sit down and just listen to them, or if you're reading, you know, a paperback or electronically, don't be multitasking during these climaxes. The resolution, this is where I'm really going to spoil it all for you. By the end of the 3rd book, the human race has managed to escape Earth, which they have managed to completely hose up with a big war. And the different factions of the human race have gone off to different planets, habitable planets, that the Bobs have discovered and made habitable for them. And there's a lot of variety in these planets. You've got one faction of Bobs that are off in a sort of Jurassic, sort of dinosaur-filled planet. You've got others that are on a planet that's much more cold, a little bit less developed. It's still got plants and animals, but it's just fairly cold. There is a water planet that has basically no land, but it's all sea, but it's got a ton of animal life under the sea. That planet's actually fairly interesting because you end up getting floating cities and flying cities that the Bobs invent for the inhabitants of Earth. By the end of the 3 books, they end up defeating utterly an entire race of intelligent aliens called the Others, and you know, they basically were the major threat to the universe, and so that, you know, they basically had to go. They've also discovered 2 other intelligent species. One that's sort of in an industrial age. They're sort of cat-like, and they are sort of a bit of a tragedy. Their planet and most of their population gets wiped out, but the Bobs managed to save about 20,000 of them and relocate them to a safer planet. There's the other intelligent race that the Bobs have been basically playing God to in an effort to save them from extinction. This race was on their way out, and so the Bobs are kind of doing an intervention here. You've got one character, or one Bob clone, who has found love again. Basically, he found a human woman, a researcher, and they kind of started dating. He built himself an android body, and they would go out dating. There's a bit of some conflict there as to whether people feel that's appropriate. Eventually, the woman dies, and in her will says, you know, go ahead and make me like the Bobs. You know, load up my personality as an AI so I can be with this AI boyfriend of mine. Those 2 go off exploring. They basically become sort of ecologists or biologists of the universe. They're going to go and catalog the universe together. Lastly, you've got sort of this army of Bob clones that's kind of like, well, we've done our part. It's time to kind of step away from the human race. You know, the human race is now on several planets, several colonies, and they're all self-sustaining and doing their own thing. Now we need to go out and explore and do kind of what we always wanted to do in the first place, which was just be nerdy. So they become much less interested in cloning themselves more, and just more interested in going out and seeing what's out in the universe, exploring more. The thing about this resolution that I really like is that, again, doing the job of good sci-fi writing, it leads to so many thoughts of what if. What if this happened? What if that happened? There's so many possibilities. There's so many mini stories that could come out of this universe still, which I think is a mark of a really good resolution. And yet, there isn't this feeling of unresolved plot lines. Like there aren't threads that are just sort of hanging out there. There wasn't a plot line that you were emotionally invested in and waiting for the next chapter to cover, and yet it just never came. Alright, so the final wrap up, likes and dislikes. I really liked the nerd culture references. They made sense to me. I think that they will stick around for a long time to come. That's the risk that you take when you put in references to pop culture or nerd culture throughout a book, is that it will date your book. But I think these references have lasted pretty long as they are, and so they should stick around. They weren't terribly obscure. I'll say it again, I really liked that this series does an excellent job of being just sci-fi, imagining possibilities. A future could be like this, and really kind of getting you thinking. The other thing that I really liked about this series and the writing is that it left me, the reader, in a really motivated state emotionally. You kind of get done reading about all the stuff that Bob or some character has gotten done recently, and you kind of feel like, oh, I'm going to get on with some of my own stuff. And maybe that was just me, but I did get that vibe off of this, which was a phenomenal feeling to be getting from a book. One dislike that I'll have, I've mentioned a few nitpicks throughout this video, but the one major dislike that I have, and it's not a serious thing because it happens in so much sci-fi, is just having so many POVs, and you do as a reader get invested in certain plot lines, and so you find yourself almost wanting to kind of flip through or fast forward to the next chapter that's going to cover the plot line that you're interested in, rather than reading through one that you're less interested in. And that can be somewhat frustrating. Suddenly your book feels a little like a choose your own adventure. So that was my take on the series. Again, this is the Bobiverse series by Dennis E. Taylor, and I will leave links to Audible and whatnot in the description below if you are interested. Like, subscribe, comment, share, etc., and I will see you all next time in another video.